fly fishing can be pretty complex sometimes, and that complexity can be overwhelming. It can be frustrating, and it can just be so easy to feel like you are messing every single thing up. When all that happens, when you feel like you have no clue what you're doing, it's easy to feel like you will never have the success that you need to be a good angler. One of the best ways to have success early on in your angling career is just to simplify the sport down to its basics. Master those basics, and you will more quickly be able to master everything else that comes along with fly fishing. On this week's episode of Untangled, we are joined by Matthew Lourdeau of the Casting Across website and podcast. Matthew has taught his 4 boys how to fish, he used to guide, and he's been fishing almost his whole life. If anybody can make fly fishing simple, it's somebody who's taught kids just like Matthew has. You're going to want to stay tuned for the rest of this week's episode, where you are going to learn some of the best simple fly fishing tips for beginners. This is Untangled, Fly Fishing for Everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. Lucky to be joined this week by none other than Matthew Lourdeau from Casting Across, the blog and podcast. We've got him on the show this week. Matthew, it's great to have you here, man. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you, Spencer. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to it as well. I think we're going to have a good little conversation about a lot of different things is what I'm hoping for today. But before we get into that, just a little bit of background on Matthew and who he is. How long have you been running Casting Across the blog for now?
So it started off as just the website in 2015, I believe. So it'll be 9 years this year. And then the podcast came in. Oh boy, I think that was in 2017 or 18.
So you're like one of the OG, like, I have a podcast guys, not like everybody now, because everybody now has one. So
yeah, it's definitely a crowded space, but honestly, I think there's room enough for everybody. I mean, I do something a little bit different, and there's not a lot there's a lot of same ground, but I mean, it's fly fishing, so there's only so many things that can be talked about. But
exactly,
I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, well, it's awesome, and you're the dad of 4 boys, is that correct?
Correct. 11, 9, 7, and 5.
Man, that's impressive. I'll tell you, that's tip my hat to you right there. The world needs more dads. I'll always stand behind that. But I think one thing, and this is going to be kind of the theme for the show today, is that when you start teaching other people about fly fishing, probably especially your own kids, you start to learn a ton more yourself about fly fishing. Yeah, I've noticed that just doing this show. This is episode 64, so I'm nowhere near the output you are. You said episode 273 just dropped for you recently.
Correct.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm nowhere near Matthew's stratosphere here, but it's interesting to me how much more I feel like I've learned just since I started doing the show, and it'll be interesting to dig into that. But before we dig into all of that stuff, I want you to share your fish story with us, man. How did you get started? What's kept you interested in fly fishing for your life? You know, why are you still doing it? You could be doing a lot of other things with your time and money. So why chase fish, right?
Right. That's a great question, Spencer. So I grew up in the Midwest for like my youngest years. And so I remember fishing for bluegill in canals and in little ponds and just really enjoying kind of the mystery of what was down there. It just was really fascinating to me. I started fly fishing when I was 14, I think. I had a buddy who wanted to go fishing in a particular river in Pennsylvania. And he tried to fish there, and the game warden told him he couldn't fish there because it was fly fishing only. And so he went and started learning about fly fishing, and he said, well, you've got to try it too. And that's when I started fly fishing. And from there, it really took off. I mean, especially for teenagers and talking about kids, it's the same thing I would say for just that, that whole childhood age. Like if you find something you like, it can become just another thing, or it can become all consuming. And for me, fly fishing became all consuming. And
It
we spent
really has a funny way of doing that, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I can remember as a teenager, one of my very first jobs, I did facilities for a church actually. And I remember setting up chairs and setting up a stage and thinking, I'm getting $100 tonight. I need $250 for this particular rod, $100 for this reel, $50 for this line. So that's 1, 2, 3. I remember very distinctly like rehearsing the Cabela's catalog in my head and thinking how many chairs it would take to get that rod, reel, and line. It was just it was everything. And
what was
I got involved in a.
Remember?
What's that?
Sorry to interrupt, but what was your first fly rod? Do you remember?
My first fly rod was a Crystal River. So that's an off-brand. I think it was made by Cortland. But it was definitely like a big box store, a department store fly rod. But my first real fly rod was a 7-foot 3-weight St. Croix Avid. And I paired that with a Clearwater 3-4 reel and some Cortland, 444 line. I have the rod and the reel.
I love that 444 line. I still fish it on a couple of my reels. So sorry to interrupt. I always love
that's fine.
Your side of things. So I've always got to ask.
Yeah. So anyway, then kind of the next piece of the addiction and the growth was I went to one of the original Trout Unlimited youth camp, where I learned that there was this whole other history, conservation, culture component to fly fishing. And that really ramped it up. So that was when I was like 17 and just took off from there. Started working at a couple different companies, worked retail, got into casting instruction and guiding and individual rod sales. Came back, worked as a volunteer for Trout Unlimited at their youth camps and some of their leadership council stuff. And then life got really busy. So something that I'm vocationally in ministry. I've been a pastor for almost 15 years now.
Oh, wow.
And so life just got really busy between that and then starting to have kids. And casting across was really kind of birthed to keep my one foot in the industry. I'm very content to just fish, but I really enjoy the people. I really enjoy the culture. I really enjoy the community of fly fishing, and casting across kind of gives me a structured way to stay involved in something that was such a significant part of my life for so many years.
That's awesome. I love that. Yeah. I didn't know that you guided as well. Where'd you guide?
The Mid-Atlantic. So Pennsylvania or Maryland and Virginia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was it all fly fishing guiding, or were you doing?
Yeah, all fly fishing. I remember I did carry a spinning rod in my car for my smallmouth trips, and I never had to bust it out. And the reason is that people would catch bluegill, and then I'd say, okay, now it's time to switch bigger flies. Let's go after smallmouth, right? And after maybe 15, 20 minutes of not hooking up using bigger flies on smallmouth, they would always, to a man, go back and say, can we catch bluegill? I'm like, you're paying me hundreds of dollars an hour. And I mean, it's fun. I'm not denying that. But it was all fly fishing, a lot of warm water in Virginia. It was a lot of fun.
That's really good. So I didn't even know guiding for bluegill was a thing. That's awesome.
It wasn't. It was smallmouth, and when those fish wouldn't play, the panfish would they would keep people captivated.
I love that's one thing I miss about my parents live down in southern Utah, and there's a lot of panfish and bass in southern Utah. I miss that aspect. I love living in the Rockies. Don't get me wrong. I love fly fishing for trout, but I miss those panfish sometimes because there's just a lot of fun going after those panfish. Well, I love it, man. That's a wonderful story. I think I love how you got into it because the game warden told your buddy that, no, you can't fish here. That's awesome. Oh, yeah. That's fantastic. Well, you know what? Let's dive into this a little bit more. Let's keep this conversation going like we were talking about. You guided, you're a casting instructor. So teaching people how to fish is not new to you, especially teaching beginners how to fish is not a new concept for you at all. But I want to kick things off with this question. What is the most valuable thing that you have learned about fly fishing from teaching either your kids to fish or during your guiding? Like, what's that
Mm.
most valuable thing that you've learned, the skill that has actually maybe it's even made you a better angler?
Mm. I think that, I mean, there's so many good things I've learned. There's so
Yeah.
many things I can look back on and remember where I was. Whether it was in a podcast or whether it was sitting in a classroom or whether I was fishing with somebody. But the one thing that kind of draws all those pieces together, both like teaching kids, learning from well-respected men. I mean, some of the most prominent names in Eastern angling I've had the opportunity to fish with and spend time with, is just have fun. And that's the very first thing that I like to communicate to people is
Mhm.
fun over fish. All right. So fun over fish. And for kids, sometimes that means you get all geared up. You have everything. Everyone has fresh leaders, fresh tippet, fly is tied on. They're all geared up. Everything's set to go. The lunches are packed. You've set aside this day, and you end up playing in the water. You end up turning over rocks, and they could care less that there's trout in the stream. They're more fascinated by finding different caddisflies in their nymphal stage in their shucks, or getting creeped out by hellgrammites, or finding a frog, and remembering that, like, ultimately, like, when you reduce fly fishing down to its core, like, that's what we're all doing, is we're exploring outdoors and we're having fun. We choose to do it with fly rod. We choose to do it with a particular set of skills and a particular set of ethics. But when it all comes down to it, we're just exploring creation and we're enjoying what's in the world. And so for me, I know a lot of guys who'd say, you know what, I fish for a few hours, I have a beer, or I fish for a few hours and then I take pictures of birds, or I fish for a few hours, and whether the fishing is good or not good, I put myself down and take a nap, and that's how I enjoy fishing. And they're not wrong. I mean, there's no right or wrong. I mean, fly fishing is such a qualitative activity in so many ways, for all of the numbers, for all of the leader formulas, for all of the rod taper designs that matter, that are interesting. When it all boils down to it, fly fishing is a qualitative recreational activity. And so, the application for that for my kids may very well be, Matthew, chill out. If they want to find sticks and have a sword fight on the side of the bank of the stream, as long as it's not bothering anybody else and they're not using the fly rods, that's a great day well spent. Or if it's me, if I'm really grinding and the fish are not responding and it's just not a lot of fun, look around and say, maybe I'm going to go for a hike instead. Maybe I'm going to, call it in early. There's a really good burger place that is going to still be open if I leave now, and
Yeah.
just enjoy the day that way. And so that's not like how to catch more fish, but it's a good mentality, I think, and a good ethic to communicate to your kids, to say, hey, we're not
Yeah,
about this
or
to like catch all the
yeah, or
fish.
any beginner, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I like that because I think especially in the last, 5, 6, 7 years, we've I don't wanna say we've sucked the fun out of fly fishing, but I
Mm,
think the fly fishing industry has we're seeing the results of becoming such a numbers-oriented sport like
mm,
we were for
yeah.
so long, which for a long time it really was. Well, how many did you catch? How big were they? And
Yeah.
post the pics on Facebook and Instagram. And I think we're seeing
Yeah.
the pendulum swing back. We see the big companies posting on social media now the same stuff you just articulated
Yeah.
better than they do. So maybe there's another job, another side hustle for you there, Matt. Um,
Yeah.
but no, I think sometimes I forget it because I get so frustrated,
Mhm.
when I get out
Yeah.
there on the water. I'm like, "Why won't this fish eat my freaking fly? What am I doing wrong? What am I" and it's
Yeah.
really easy to get frustrated. So I think that's something that every beginner and every angler really needs to remember too is it's gotta be fun because if it's not
Yeah.
fun, what the heck are you doing? There's a lot cheaper ways to get frustrated than to go out and
Exactly.
fly fish.
Yeah.
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 No, that's wonderful.
Yep.
So, all right. So we're going to remind folks to be fun. And you had a few other wonderful tips here that you actually shared with me before we started the show. So why don't you go through the rest of your tips? I'd love to hear the rest of these from you.
Sure. So the other thing that kind of is a corollary to that, but is definitely more fishing focused because,
Uh-huh.
if I'm teaching somebody to fish and we bail because it's not a good time, if they're still interested, we're going to go back at it. We're not going to say, oh, you're interested in fishing, but you really like having some bourbon on the side of the stream. We're done fishing now. Every time we get together, we're going to just go outside and drink bourbon, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but fishing is still kind of what we're aiming for. So whether it be an adult or whether it be a kid. And so one of the things that I really encourage people to do is focus on fish over that fish. So this almost goes, speaks to the conversation we had a moment ago about my guiding for smallmouth. And it wasn't every time, but the handful of times that stand out to me were guys who had, big high-powered DC jobs that really were just content to catch bluegill on a fly rod. And they were river bluegill. So they had this, this just big muscly shoulders on them, and they put a bend in an 8-weight, and it was so much fun. And they got frustrated when I gently pushed them to try to catch smallmouth, because for me, I was thinking, you spent X many $100s to try to catch smallmouth, and you're catching bluegill. But they were totally content catching bluegill. I talked through them what smallmouth would entail, what they might want to think about the next time they go fishing, how bluegill fishing is different. But whether it be a formal client for a guide, or whether it be a dad or a mom taking their kids out fishing, then to say, you know what, I want my kid to learn how to catch trout. I want my kid to learn how to catch wild trout on the historic river using size 18 dry flies fished with silk leaders and a bamboo rod.
Well, I mean,
that's a fine goal to have.
Fly fishing, right?
I know. Anything less than that is basically bait, right?
Exactly.
If that's your goal, awesome. Like, by all means, I've got these lofty goals for my kids this summer for some particular trout fishing things that I haven't really told them about it, but I'm thinking, they're getting to that point where I want to push them a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, if it's, we're switching over to bluegill, or we're going to go to where I know there's a lot of stocked fish, because I want you to at least just work on your drift, work on mending, work on your cast, work on, nymphing, work on dry fly, at least there's fish that are going to respond to that. And as you said earlier too, like, there's nothing wrong with a spinning rod. I mean, you can be legal with it. You can be ethical with it. I think that it's wise, and I always have, when my kids are fishing and we can fish this way, I always have a spinning rod and I always have bait, because I'd rather them have fish than have no fish, especially when they're younger. I don't care if the 11-year-old gets a little bit frustrated, but I don't want my 5-year-old to get frustrated.
Yeah.
So
frustrated 5. Nobody wants that. That's like me without my Diet Coke. You don't want to see it. Yeah, it's not going to end well. So,
yeah.
No, and I like that too, because I think, like I mentioned earlier, the focus is often so much on catching a big fish or catching a certain size of fish, and the smaller fish get looked down on, which really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I mean, my local stream here, most of the fish I catch out of it are between 10 to 12 inches, but I choose to fish there. I've got 2 tailwaters within an hour of me, and I've caught 20 plus inch fish out of those tailwaters multiple times, but I still go to the closer one more often than not, just because I enjoy it. Right. So it's finding that level. And when I guided, I used to take clients to, there's this one little spot I could take them to that was full of like 8-inch brook trout. And they'd kind of look at me like, really? You want me to fish here? And I'm like, just trust me. And they'd throw the fly out, and they'd catch their first little 8-inch brook trout on a dry fly. And there were days when we did not leave that spot for the whole 8 hours, because they just wanted to sit there and keep doing it. So I think that's really true, that, just focus on catching fish first, get those principles down, and then you're going to be able to move on when you have that opportunity to go after the trout or whatever else it is you're chasing.
Yeah. And I think something that plays into that as well, and maybe it's another principle for this, and this is true no matter what you do, but especially for fishing, especially for fly fishing. If you go into it thinking that you're going to be able to have that same experience while you're also guiding somebody, either for money or for, don't bring a flyer if you're guiding, but if you're guiding somebody just that's new, you're not, you're in for a totally different experience, an incredibly rewarding experience.
Mhm.
But I know for a lot of people who've taken their kids fishing, that's one of the biggest hangups is they thought they were going to fish as well. And that just isn't going to, and it's going to make everyone miserable.
Yeah.
And really, and this speaks more to, the investment of teaching kids, whether it be your kids, grandkids, neighbor kids, whatever it may be, is that you're putting in these years of not fishing or not fishing in any substantive way. And one day it might pay off where now you have somebody who is a partner in crime for going fishing. But then the same thing holds true if you're taking a buddy fishing. If you say, hey, you go over there and you cast and you fish, you might be slaying it and you look upstream and he's all tangled up and not having a good time. What have you gained? And people are nice. They'll say, oh, I had fun. It was fun just being outside. But is that what you're wanting to help them with? And so I think that's something else to keep in mind with that. Like they might want to catch trout, big trout, even though they're catching small trout, or they might want to catch smallmouth, even though you've put them on a bunch of bluegill, but you're over having fun doing something else. Is, just pay it to it. I wrote an article years ago about how there are so many corollary pieces between being a guide and teaching someone how to fish, and how you both are going to have a better experience if you give them your full attention. And that's true, especially for kids, especially people who are brand new. Think about how you'd want to be treated by somebody you're paying to fish, and then go over and above that when you're trying to help somebody that's someone who's close to you. It doesn't mean that you can't say, hey, listen, last hour of the day, I'm going to go do my thing. I'll catch up in a little bit. But by and large, giving them that kind of attention is going to really pay off.
Yeah. And I think something folks might overlook too when they're thinking, oh, I'm going to take my kids out, or, oh, my buddy, especially with, oh, my buddy wants to learn. I think folks overlook how rewarding it can be to teach people, to help people
Absolutely.
out. I mean, I teach full time. That's my job right now, teach high school English. There's certainly a reward aspect to that, but I mean, you wouldn't have been writing casting across for this long if there wasn't if you didn't gain something from that act of helping anglers through the writing process too, because you're helping them that way, even if you're not directly guiding them.
Yeah, I think for me too, if I'm thinking about a concept, whether it's something as mundane as how to choose a strike indicator for a certain situation, or something a little bit more lofty, something that has to do with ethics, something that has to do with like a historical analysis of some aspect of fly fishing. For me, there is a very healthy and very real way in which processing that and learning to articulate it and communicate it well is how I get to the point where I truly understand it. I think we've all run into that where there's a lot of incredibly knowledgeable fly shop employees or folks that are associated with a brand, and they know their product really, really well, but they might struggle in explaining it to somebody else. And at the end of the day, they're probably not making as many sales as they could if they could articulate it more or better. And they're also not helping people out as much. And for me, even though I might not have the same level of expertise on a wider range of topics, the things that I do know, I try to be able to explain to my 5-year-old or to my 55-year-old neighbor when I take them fishing so that they get it. They might not be able to do it, but they can at least understand it.
Yeah, and it goes a long way. It really does. And then to your point too, it's going to pay off with, maybe one of your kids will be fishing with you. One of my good fishing buddies here in Wyoming, he's about to be 60. So I tie on a lot of his flies for him because his eyes are finally starting to go bad. And that's the one old man thing I don't make fun of him for. I'll make fun of him for all the other old man stuff, but I don't make fun of him for that because I know it's coming for me someday. And I hope that there's somebody there to tie my flies on for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, it really is. Plus, your ability to understand these concepts deepens when you do try to teach it to people. So there is a learning aspect in it for us. be it whether we're teaching kids or whether we're just teaching our buddy how to fish too.
Yeah, I think that really when you're trying to explain something, it really reveals those things that The way I like to describe it is like you see it in the periphery, so you kind of get the whole picture, and you know it's there. But when you go to look at it straight on, you're like, that's not as in focus as I thought it was. So something as simple as why do we use leaders that are in the particular taper that they're in? Why? Well, I know that this casts these flies better. Well, why? And to be able to walk through that and understand the dynamics of tippet diameter, tippet rigidity or stiffness, or how supple it is, and to be able to walk through that, and you say, oh, maybe now that I understand this better, I can approach my leader construction, or when I do and don't add tippet, in a little bit more efficient way, because I kind of get a bigger picture of this. It's always like, oh, I do it because it works. That's going to get you 95% of the way. But you might have another 5% you can gain once you understand it a little bit better. And that's the kind of thing that comes along with trying to teach somebody frequently.
Yeah, no, 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
So what else do we do to help kids out? Specifically, you mentioned, we've talked about it a lot, the experience as well.
Yeah.
Of just getting them out there on the water, but it's more than just getting them out on the water too, isn't it?
Yeah. I think, like I said before, I am just a huge fan of the fly fishing community.
Mm-hmm.
Just such a great, diverse group of folks, people I wouldn't normally spend time with, just on a 9 to 5 or, Monday to Friday basis. And so there's so many pieces that go into that. So, for example, getting the picture of what the entire fly fishing experience might look like. So my boys are so excited to wake up and get breakfast on the way to go fishing. Like a couple of them will be talking more about what we're having breakfast. What can we drink? Do I get coffee? Do I get hot chocolate? And I mean, I get pumped about that. When I wake up and I'm cold and I have an hour and a half drive, like that bacon, egg, and cheese biscuit for me is more important than trout for, a good few hours. Right. So bringing them along in that, like, these are the things that my buddies and I, we prioritized when we were younger because it was so important. So bringing the kids along in that, reading fly fishing books to them, whether it be, something like Big Two-Hearted River, or even just like a kid's fishing book, Down by the River is a really popular one. And just talking about, and so they can kind of get that ethos and everything that surrounds fly fishing and understand there's more to it than going and catching fish. I bring my kids to a fly fishing show every year, and let them walk around and let them interact with people I know and people I don't know. Let them, pick out a dozen flies that probably won't work, but makes them happy for whatever reason.
Yep.
Another big one is let your kid have their own fly box. I mean, all my kids have their own fly box, their own pack, their own tackle box, their own, all that stuff. And let them take ownership of it, and they fill it with the dumbest, ugliest, most useless stuff, but don't we all? And so that's another thing where they take ownership of it, and they go through and they say, what is this fly? What is this fly? What is this fly? I'm like, well, they're 3 squirmy wormies, but they're going to catch fish. So,
that squirmy wormy is deadly, man.
Exactly.
It's kind of frustrating how well it works for how ridiculous it looks. But
yeah, my first greenback cutthroat in Colorado was on a squirmy wormy.
Oh wow, that's a violation of some kind of Colorado. I didn't even know you could fish squirmies in Colorado. To be honest,
you might not be able to. I could have just outed myself.
28 midges, but no, I give Coloradans a good hard time on the show, but they know it's all in good fun, because there's a lot of truth to it too. A lot of those fish in Colorado just want the tiniest bugs, and it's so frustrating.
Yeah.
No, yeah, those are wonderful.
Yeah.
Books. I never would have thought to read books to my. I don't have kids yet, but I've got some books on the shelf behind me here. I'm like, well, maybe they'd like some John Gierach, or I've got a little bit Cormac McCarthy. I'm probably not going to read that to the kids, but I really like that. I think that's a very interesting way to expose them to it and get them interested in it.
Yeah. And, they'll pick it up in a new way because of that. Like, for example, one of my boys, He said to me last season, he's like, Dad, I catch so many more fish in a spinning rod. I'm like, all right, great. Let's go fishing. Like I'm not gonna force him to fly fish if he wants to fish. Like that is the most dogmatic, ridiculous thing I think to expect of a 10-year-old, 9-year-old. But then we're at the fly fishing show, and he's watching these presentations of these casting instructors. I mean, stuff that I've told him, but it's always better coming from someone who's not dad. And then he's got his, $30, $40 in his wallet, and says, I want to buy a book. And it's just like some Orvis Kids Fishing Guide. I'm like, buddy, all that information on the internet. I have all that stuff. He's like, I want it. Okay, knock yourself out. And he has poured over it multiple times in the last few weeks. I'm like, how dumb was that for me to like discourage him from buying a book that he wanted that was engaging him in a way that I couldn't. And in a way that probably the books that are written for that, I would say, oh, you've got enough skills to read this adult book. That this is fun and it's silly and he loves it. And so just opening up those pathways for them to experience it in a way that runs kind of parallel to what I'm doing, but in a different way. I think it really, really helps.
Well, it does. And I want to touch on something you said right at the beginning of that. You talked about, why would I discourage my kid from fishing with a spinning rod because he catches more fish that way? And I think couldn't we expand that to the fly anglers who are dead set on fishing dry flies or Euro nymphing, and say, why would you lock yourself into just that one way to fish when there's streamers, there's indicator nymphing, there's dry dropper rigs? Like, why would you force yourself to only do that? I understand from the skill building perspective that you want to try and build that, but at the same time, I think a lot of us need to be a little bit more like kids, where we're just like, let's go ahead and throw out there what's out there. I mean, I'm at the point now where I want to fish dry flies the most, and if I go out and catch a couple fish on dries, that fulfills me. And I'm fine catching 2 or 3 fish on a dry fly versus 10 on nymphs. That's just what I enjoy. But I think it's a little narrow-minded sometimes to almost do the same thing you were describing there, where we force ourselves, hey, I'm not gonna I'm only gonna fly fish this way, instead of opening up all the different avenues we have to catch fish. So I thought that was a really well made point there. I appreciate it.
Of course.
Yeah. Well, any other practical tips that
you mentioned some of the flies, and I think that's a big one. Like, being able to fish multi-fly rigs with a kid is big, and that means probably working on their cast so that they're not casting in a really dramatic way, which, I mean, the kids enjoy doing, but say, you know what, just like with adults, if you're flipping a multi-fly rig, you're going to flip it. We're not going to really cast it, and help them work with that. But whether it be a dry dropper for cold water fish or warm water fish, or I like fishing a multiple nymph rig or wet fly rig with a cider fly that they can see. And so if I know that deep down mid is going to, or the deep down nymph is going to catch a fish, put a bigger, bulkier nymph on there that they can see and essentially use as a submerged bobber. I think things like that are I mean, they're great for all of us, but it keeps the kid engaged. It reduces one of those variables of distraction. And that's one of the things that I try to do as much as I can. Multi-fly rigs, I think, is a really great way to get anybody into fish and paying attention to some of those more subtle things, drift, what a strike looks like, drag, things like that. So that's definitely a practical tip that goes beyond like buying breakfast.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Oh, sorry. Did you have anything else to add?
No, I mean, there's lots of different things, but I would just say, long time casting before you get on the water. I think we all know that you're not going to get the same sort of experience pulling line up off of the grass as you get on water. You don't have that surface tension. At the same time, the amount of distractions, again, for a new angler, particularly a child, can be overwhelming when you get on the water and the prospect of catching a fish is right there in front of you. So long time make it fun, make it a game. I did the same when I taught casting instructions for adults. I made it into a game, and it takes away some of that anxiety and that stress of trying to get it just perfect. And the same
How
thing
would
is
you
true
make
for
it into
kids.
a game? That's really, I've never heard someone describe it that way before.
So I like putting targets in different places, not just on the ground. So I, obviously put hula hoops. I mean, that makes all the sense in the world. Put hula hoops in the ground because that replicates, trying to make a presentation in one particular spot.
Mhm.
But something else that I like to do is put like sawhorses up or other more like vertical targets, because that can take away the propensity when you are learning to cast to hula hoops or horizontal targets to kind of shoot at them, as opposed to letting that line extend, roll out, and drop down. And so putting a vertical target up, and assigning point values. I don't do that with adults, but for kids, I do assign point values for different targets and syncing a target that's behind a sawhorse, behind a cardboard box, is worth more to a kid than putting it in a hula hoop at that same distance.
Yeah,
And
worth
so,
more breakfast points, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
with
build up their breakfast points for them.
and with boys, everything's a competition. I wouldn't even have to make it a game. With four
Yeah.
boys, it's going to become a competition no matter
Well,
what. So,
I bet, man. That's four boys, man.
yeah.
And I think it's tough. I got a class of like 8 kids, and they're mostly boys, and I think that's tough. I can't imagine being a dad of 4 boys. It's tough.
It's all
It's
the
tough
time.
in a good way. It's tough in a good
Yeah,
way, of course.
absolutely.
Yeah. No, I'd never heard anybody describe casting as a game, and I really like that point you made about the vertical targets too, because
Mhm.
that's something I saw when I was guiding. If folks don't learn to keep that rod tip straight, they bring
Mhm.
it too far forward on that front cast, and all the line piles in front of their feet. So they can have
Yeah.
this really good loop going, and it can look
Mhm.
beautiful, and they can be in really good shape, and then they can ruin it all with that one just too far forward cast.
Right.
And I think it's important for folks to remember that. And
Yep.
getting that lawn time. There were guide trips, especially if I was taking folks who'd never fished before. I would spend usually the first 20-30 minutes making them cast by the truck. And there were some of them
Mhm.
that were visibly upset because we're right next to the river. They're like, well, why aren't we down there? And I'm like, because you gotta learn you've never held a fly rod before. This is your first
Mhm.
time. Like you got to start at the beginning. And there's no shame. There's no shame at all in starting at the
Right.
beginning. I think for anybody, wherever they're at in their journey. So,
Absolutely.
um, biggest challenge that you've had
Hmm.
to face when you've taken your kids fishing, other than maybe a disagreement over a breakfast spot or something like that?
So the biggest challenge, and this is could be a personality flaw, but I think this is consistent with other people I've talked to that have done this with fishing, hunting, baseball, golf, you name it. Um, it's knowing when to push and knowing when to pull back.
Yeah.
Um, this summer we were out on a lake, and I knew that the fishing was just going to heat up once the moon got a little higher and the barometer changed a little bit. I felt it. It was one of those things where I was just, the bass were just going to come on. I knew it. And he didn't want to stay out. He wanted to go in. He knew that his cousins were watching a movie inside, and it was just like, buddy, if we give it 10 more minutes, you're going to enjoy it. I guarantee you. And it got where if he could have caught the biggest bass in the world in that moment, he wouldn't have cared because
Mhm.
he was frustrated and he was upset. And the same thing is true with, teaching fly casting. I mean, just go back to the thing that we just talked about that sounds so
Yeah.
much fun. After, 15, 20 minutes, if they're done, you don't say, listen, you're had a little bit of a tailing loop. If we can just get this ironed out, it doesn't matter. If they're going to grump, their shoulders are going to drop and sag, and their casting's going to stink because their posture's bad. So it's like,
Yep.
what's the point? Why even force it?
It's learning when
Particularly
it's
when they're
good
younger.
enough versus perfection, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And know that there's tomorrow. Know there's tomorrow. I mean, that's the great thing is that going back to that bass pond story. I guess he didn't have a great night watching the movie with his cousins. They beat him in Mario Kart. I don't know, whatever happened. So the next day he's like, I don't care. I'm not going in and play. I want to stay out and fish because he said it was going to be so good. We stayed out late. He caught big bass, and it was like, I didn't have to do a thing. It all just worked out on its own. So,
Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
No, I think there's a lot in there for all of us to take back. And the last question I want to end with, so I don't want to take too much of your time here this evening either, but the last question I want to end with is kids can teach us a whole ton. I've
Mm.
noticed that as a high school teacher, even high school age kids can teach you a ton.
Mm.
They can frustrate the heck out of you, but they can teach you a ton. What uh what specifically do you think we as adult anglers can learn from kids about
Mm.
fishing?
Mm. I think it's the wonder. I mean, it really is. It's that sense of wonder and joy and exploration.
Mhm.
Um, I feel like I still have that, but then you see how excited the kids get when they catch a bluegill, when
Mhm.
they see a salamander, when they, are build a little rock wall and just watch how water flows over it. It's like we have all these ideas about drift and flow and hydrology and geology and how that all works
Yep.
together. And your kids, they move rocks around in a little side channel, they're exploring that for the first time, and they're getting that information. They're not getting it from a textbook. You're not having to explain it to them, and they're experiencing it in a fun way, and it is alive to them. So I think for me, if I ever am feeling like I'm pressing for catching fish, spending time outdoors, accomplishing some arbitrary goal I've set for myself, just remind myself that I watch my kids, watch how much fun they have just doing simple things, and say, you know what? I can spend half an hour turning over rocks and finding macroinvertebrates and enjoy that and not see it necessarily as I have to dial in how to match the hatch right now. Like this is fun also, and it probably will pay off in some way. So I would say appreciating their wonder as they see so many of these things with fresh eyes, non-cynical eyes, non-jaded eyes is something that we can all learn from.
I couldn't have put it better myself, Matthew.
Mm.
That's yeah, 100%. I'm with you on that. And
Mm.
not to not to sound arrogant, not to sound like I am doing it right, but of all the things that I do in fly fishing, and I don't ever purport to be some expert who knows everything. And if anybody's listened to the show before, they know that. And if anybody's ever fished with me, they know that. It's very obvious. But the one thing, I know we should try to avoid pride, right?
Mm.
It's one of the seven deadly sins for a reason. But the one thing that I do pride myself on is I feel like I haven't lost that ability to stop and
Mm.
appreciate it, stop and smell the
Mm.
roses yet, and I hope I never lose it.
Mm.
Because I'll get crap from some fishing buddies sometimes, and I don't fish with them as much anymore now because I will just wanna stop and look at the view. When we
Mm.
go and if there's deer or elk out and I'm driving, I pull over, I pull the binos out, and I just wanna sit and stare at the elk or the deer.
Yeah.
I don't care that I've seen 1,000 of them. I haven't seen that one, and I wanna see it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's something that I talked about this on a recent show. The you don't wanna rush through the beginning part of your angling experience because how
Mm.
much fun was that first fish that you caught? How exhilarating
Yeah.
was that, Matthew?
Yeah. Yeah.
It blew your mind, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And
You
it can
can't redo
still
firsts.
no, but it can still blow your mind if you appreciate it, and I hate to use the phrase like, "Well, it was just good to get outside," but sometimes it really is. Sometimes it
Yeah.
really is just fantastic to get out, and you have to remember that, and you can't lose it. You've gotta hold on to that childlike wonder
Mhm.
because, I mean, especially out here in the West, trout live in some of the prettiest places on the planet, and you're gonna see stuff out there that you don't get to see otherwise. I mean,
Mhm.
there was a time I was out fishing a place, and we ran into a herd of bighorn sheep that how many other people can say they were walking down the trail, turned the corner, and there were I think there were 10 bighorn sheep and half of them were
Oh,
rams.
wow.
And that's not even a fishing experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I just Yeah, I'll piggyback off everything you said and urge people to remember it because it's important. It's important
Yep,
too.
absolutely.
Well, is there anything else you want to add, Matthew, before we wrap this up?
Oh boy, I talk all about fishing all the time, so it's a dangerous question. So, no, I think we covered a lot of the main points. I mean, it's it's just everything you do to catch fish, you can share with somebody, and as you do so, you're going to do that thing better. And so that's really my encouragement. Whether it's your kid, whether it's your neighbor, whether it's your parents that you're taking fishing, like you're going to grow, not the same rate, but in a real legitimate exponential way as you teach people.
Yeah. So where can people go to find more of your content, Matt?
So castingacross.com, I put out a new article every Monday and Wednesday. And then the Casting Across Fly Fishing podcast, it comes out every Thursday night. And then there's a post that corresponds with that every Friday on the website. So the tagline for Casting Across is the quarry and culture of fly fishing. So, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's breaking down leader formulas and getting into the minutia of fly fishing strategy, tactics, gear, fish, things like that. And sometimes it is talking about how to spend a day not fishing, how to organize your stuff, how, I try to have some snarky, smart aleck articles every once in a while.
I need the organization one. Oh my goodness, my stuff's a mess right now.
So anyway, that's what you'll find across the span of Casting Across. Right now, as of our recording of this podcast, I'm in the middle of a series called Cast One, which is really going back to the basics and the beginnings. Like, what is fly fishing? Why do we use long fly? Why are the rods so stinking long? And walking through that with a threefold benefit. One, the person who's interested in fly fishing. Two, the person who's brand new in fly fishing. Three, so much of what we talked about today, arming and equipping experienced anglers with language that may be helpful to them as they pass it on. And so it's really stepping back. And I mean, I'm not assuming my normal audience is going to listen to it, but I'm hoping it can be helpful. And it's gotten good response so far. So all that you can find is Casting Across and the Casting Across Fly Fishing podcast. I'm on social media, but I don't really do anything on social media. So, but you can reach out to me. Anybody can reach out through social media or Matthew@castingacross.com. I love interacting with people. So
perfect. We'll put links to all that in the show notes today so folks can go find it. But Matthew, really appreciate your time. I love this conversation. Yeah. And I hope you can get out on the water soon and have a good day wherever you're at. And to all the listeners as well, same thing. Get out on the water in tight lines. Until next time.